Hello, everybody. Today we are with a very amazing guest, Alessandro Keegan, all the way from New York. He's a visual artist, writer, and an adjunct professor with an MFA in painting and drawing, which depicts the forms that straddle the lines between science, nature, technology, and mysticism. His works have been exhibited in many places such as New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and the Netherlands. Keegan's art practices and ideas are the subject of a short documentary film called The Matter of Mind, released in 2020 by Full Moon Films. Thank you so much for your availability in doing this, Alessandro. I'm so very grateful for your cooperation. How are you?
Thank you so much, Jag, and thank you for asking me to do this interview. I'm excited to talk about
Yes, I'm also
subjects
very excited.
about.
So I'm going to begin with wanting to inquire a bit about your experiences in LSD and how that pivotal moment shaped you. Can you please take us through that moment and how did you navigate in that and how did you come up with this entire transcendental world and how did you encounter that and what effects you found it making it into your life?
All right. Well, thank you, Jag, for that question. I talked about this a little bit in the short film, The Matter of Mind, but I might try to go into more detail maybe as we talk here. I make paintings today, and those are the product of a lifelong exploration of different approaches to trying to communicate these ideas that are very way out there and sometimes difficult to translate into a visual form. And these ideas have their origins in certain psychedelic and visionary, I guess I would call it, visionary experiences that I had mostly when I was younger, but still persisting today. And that one particular really impactful sensation that I had or experience that I had was during one of the LSD experiences that I had when I was in my teen years. I don't mean to encourage young people to do this, but I experimented widely with a lot of psychedelic drugs when I was in my teens. Not recommending this necessarily for young brains, but this was during a time when I had taken a decent amount of LSD, and in this particular instance, something was compelling me or calling me into a wooded area that was behind the elementary school where in the town where I grew up, which was in Nyack, New York. I was maybe about 16 or 17 then. My memory's a little blurry about exactly what year this was. And I was drawn into the woods there, and it was completely dark except for the sky, which was clear, and there were all these stars in the sky. And for some reason, I was drawn to climbing into this thicket of thorns and vines for some reason, and without feeling any of the sensations of pain or these thorns cutting me or anything, I just crawled into it. I drew my body into this nest of thorns. And, at that point, I was quite on the upswing of this experience, at the peak of the experience. And I just found myself laying on my back there at night in this thicket of thorns and looking up at the stars. And I would say that what I then saw or suddenly had emanated into my mind, what poured into my mind, was just as much information as it was visual. Sometimes, by the way, the language that I'm going to use to describe these things might sound very strange and ambiguous, and it's because these are kind of indescribable experiences, really, and in this experience, I saw almost a kind of mechanical structure that underlies all of the universe or all of nature. This structure is also, it's kind of mechanical, it's kind of electrical, it's like these kind of flowing conduit-like systems, but it was also composed of consciousness, like beings that had an intelligence to them. And the two things that I became most aware of was almost in the cosmos or in the stars, kind of, there were these forms that seemed circular to me in some way. And they were like two beings. For a while, I was thinking maybe they're like two gods or deities, but I don't even know, what is a god, what is a deity, just grand entities beyond our physical realm. And these are existing in a circular way somewhere far beyond the universe. And I could see them speaking to each other, like communicating to each other like this, like what I'm doing with my hands here, this kind of interflux of communication. And that the world in which we exist, this kind of universe existence, was formed by the essence of their communication. So it's almost as if within the words or the communication that one entity is sending to another, there's these kind of worlds are born or kind of created out of that language. In retrospect, this sounds a lot like a lot of things Terence McKenna has said. I've read in language, things forming out of language, or machine elves in the DMT universe speaking with visible language. So it sounds a lot like that. Maybe it is. And I see this like creating this universe, and then somehow I become aware that this is kind of like the underlying structure of everything that is, and there's these flows of energy or emanation, which I'm using that in almost like this kind of Gnostic way, like gods are like emanating things into being. And that's kind of what we are. And part of and this is all happening as I'm laying there in the dark, and I suddenly was like, part of why we have so much confusion or so much of a misunderstanding of our purpose and existence and all this is because we're part of some kind of a message or a signal that we don't really understand and isn't really meant for us. We're the signal, not really the receiver, of the information. So this was a very strange visionary experience, and was one of many. And I don't exactly remember how that resolved itself. I think I just kind of dragged myself out of the vines, and then like later some friend of mine was like, "Are you all right?" And I was like, I guess so, and something later happened, I don't exactly remember how that resolved itself, but it was something that I continued thinking about throughout my life. And sometimes I would read things related to astrophysics or the occult, or mediumistic art, which we're going to talk about later, and it would resonate a little bit. Or there's a book by an author, Michael Talbot, I think his name is, called The Holographic Universe, which is scientific, but also a little out there and paranormal in its conversation about this. But things like that, I was like, holographic universe, that almost sounds a bit like what I was seeing or having poured into my brain, beamed into my brain. And so, as I've gone through life, I'm 41 years old now. So, I've had a lot of time to think about this. And this was, over 20 years ago.
Mhm.
I've, just kind of used that as a guide for understanding other aspects of metaphysical thought, or mystical thought as I've experienced it. And it's only been recently that this experience has consolidated itself into my more recent body of art that I've been making for the past 6 or 7 years, where I found this abstract, mostly abstract, but partly representational as well, visual language that is my own invented way of trying to talk about these things that are, almost beyond talking about. So that's that really formative experience that you're asking about. Yeah.
This is fantastic to know because wow. 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 Okay. And but how was your life before this experience, if you can tell me? And how is your life? Of course, you have partially told me how's your life right now
Yeah,
after that,
just
but
like my normal life. Yeah.
yeah.
You know,
And how did you also I mean, I know that you've integrated all of that knowledge and wisdom and that information and the downloads that you had into your work, but also putting all of that together and considering the fact that your life was different, you know, before this event, how that is
how did that
work
get
together.
integrated
Yeah,
in
yeah,
my
yeah,
life?
because
Yeah.
it's hard work. It's a lot of hard work.
Well, you know, it's not something that I like knew what to do with or what to how to talk about it right away. As like a 17-year-old kid, I just started like, you know, being like, the alien intelligences told me we're all information. You know, I was like, well, I don't know what to do with that. You know, it's like this strange experience, and maybe it was in my mind, and maybe it was actual information. Maybe it's like some veil of reality was just quickly removed. You know, I, you know, I can't say too much. I don't feel too comfortable talking about many other aspects of my personal life or childhood or anything like that. I think that in some ways I did have a very average or normal upbringing or early childhood, in the sense that there were good times and bad times, there were ups and downs. I had moments of being a troubled kid, and I had moments where I was succeeding in school and things like that. So good times and bad, you know, and that's, you know, gone for pretty much most of my life. I did at some point during those years, those high school years, because they were a time of a lot of personal trouble for me, emotionally and so forth. I did turn to art as a support mechanism, as a way of psychologically stabilizing myself. Um, if you asked me as a little kid, like when I was like 7 or 8 years old, I probably would have told you I was more interested in becoming a scientist or something. But I fell far from the qualifications for that kind of a career. And, you know, yeah, I had some moments in my teen years that were troubled. And there was actually a moment where I was briefly in a hospital and I had a spontaneous out of body experience, but without any drugs or anything. And things like that did happen occasionally throughout my life. Other weird experiences like sleep paralysis and so forth. But I would say, though, that in essence, though, my life was otherwise quite average. I think a lot of people, more than, you know, people realize, most people don't have just a sunny, normal, you know, childhood or
Of course,
upbringing. You know,
yes.
most people have a kind of, you know, ups and downs, you know, in their life. But when it finally came time for me to barely graduate high school and enter into college, I decided to major in art because that had been the um, emotional support for me throughout that time in my life, those periods in my life when things were down. And I pursued it, and I managed to make some weird paintings that got me into the MFA program at the Art Institute of Chicago, as you mentioned. And then I moved from Chicago. I grew up in New York, in the Hudson Valley area where I live now. And I moved to Chicago to go to school. And then I moved back to New York and moved to Brooklyn, New York, where I lived for 16 years. And there I, you know, had no success as an artist, you know, struggled a lot to make ends meet. The economy was very difficult during those years. And finally, I did get a decent job. And this is kind of an interesting thing that I should mention, actually. I did get a decent job working as a diamond grader at the Gemological Institute of America, which is not, I know that's not something I really put on my bio too often, but it's kind of an interesting job. It sounds scientific. It's not really as scientific as it is, though. You're really just grading gemstones. You're looking at gemstones under a microscope, up close and you're looking at the different features within them. And I think that it was during those years, I did that for a little over 2 years. It was very interesting. I didn't hate the job. I thought it was interesting. I went to Mumbai actually and worked in Mumbai for a little while during that time.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was
Oh,
great. But I also hated it because that job took me away from making art. And so
okay.
first chance I got, I quit the job and I moved on to something else. I ended up getting a second degree, which is kind of insane, in art history, and then becoming an art history teacher, which is my current day job. But the thing I wanted to say though about mentioning this, since we're talking about like my everyday life, that's
Yeah.
not me having crazy visions and stuff, is that in those years when I was working at GIA as a diamond grader, spending a lot of time in the dark looking through a microscope, I think that some of that imagery that you see inside at the molecular level or at the very microscopic level inside of gemstones, I think that did start to shape my way of thinking. This is over a decade ago now, but I think that's where this kind of imagery that has infiltrated my paintings had started to emerge. I started to see gemstones as being more than just gemstones, as being these physical metaphors for the way something invisible moves through something solid and inhabits it like a spirit inside of some kind of a solid vessel, physical vessel.
This is
So
fantastic.
so
Oh
hopefully, yeah. So hopefully
my
that's
God, this
interesting. I
is
don't
so
know.
interesting for me. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. Okay, so I know that your work is very much a surreal work, and I also know that it comes under a science fiction sort of genre.
Yeah.
But working with this sort of idea and sort of thought and everything that revolves around it and includes in it, how do you integrate with all of this, and what is the state of mind that you work with? How do you feel? How are you mentally feeling at that point, and what is really going on in that entire process of putting it together and having all of that particular kind of direction in your mind?
Yeah. So first, you asked me about surrealism and science fiction and how those relate to my work.
Yes.
And I think what I would say about that is that there are aspects of surrealism that I identify with, that I connect to, but I don't necessarily consider myself a surrealist in the purest form, in the historical sense.
Okay.
My work isn't derived from dreams. There is imagery that comes to me sometimes in meditation that I incorporate into my work. But I don't necessarily see my work as a psychological exploration or a personal psychological
Okay.
exploration. Maybe it is, but I think that that is more of what surrealism is about.
Okay.
But that said, though, I do feel some affinity towards surrealism. And likewise with science fiction, I understand why people look at my work and it looks like some kind of alien world or some
Right.
kind of futuristic world. And it is another world, and it is a alien in the sense that it's other than our experience, our physical experience. But and I grew up watching sci-fi movies. Like I love the old Outer Limits and stuff like that. But I don't know if I would call myself a science fiction artist. I'd say that I'm
Blending.
drawing from a lot of different genres, right? Um, and then I think the second part of your question, how I incorporate that into my own style or my own sensibility,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? I think that's what you're asking. And I think that at some point in the past, I worried more about how my work was going to be classified, whether it was going to be called abstraction or representational or surrealist.
Hmm.
And I think that as I've stripped away less necessary elements of my work visually, I've also stripped away a lot of unnecessary concerns about my work as well. I think that's been an important way for me to know how to make my art.
Right.
So, I concern myself with the craft of what I do, making my paintings to the best of my ability. I concern myself with visual elements and how those express certain emotional qualities or tonal qualities within the work.
Mhm.
I think about the language that I've created, this imagery and what it's supposed to be talking about.
Mhm.
And one thing that I don't really think about anymore is how it's going to be classified, right? I don't think about, you know, are these going to be seen as figurative paintings, or are these going to be seen as surrealism or something? And I think does that answer that question? I think that
Yeah, pretty
you're
much.
kind of asking it.
But also mostly about like, what do you feel like? Because you, now that you have told me that you have stripped away all of the feeling of, say, how it's going to be judged and how people are going to see it, I want to know what you are personally feeling when you're doing it. And I think when even if when you know that, okay, um say it's not, say, sci-fi genre, or it is not a surreal genre, what exactly the feeling is, irrespective of it is a sci-fi or a surreal or whatever, what do you go through? What state do you find yourself in when you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I think every artist is different, in their experience when they're making work. But I feel also, as I talk about this, I think there's probably going to be someone, who might be listening to this, or, some artist who's going to very strongly identify with this. I go through a lot of peaks and valleys while I'm working. Initially, my work comes out of this extremely focused, I think of it as a kind of meditation where I try to let all of these unnecessary elements drop out of my mind, and I focus on visualizing what's going to be created in the painting. And I start off by making drawings on the painting that are very, very simple. And I'm in this state where uh, I'm almost not even there. Time itself is not even there. Time drops away.
Mhm.
My intentions sometimes even disappear for a while. But
Mhm.
then I go into periods where I'm obsessed, and I have this just obsession. It's like this thing that needs to be done. It's like gnawing at me. If I have an unfinished painting in the studio, it's like I can't just sit and have dinner at night. I'm like thinking about it. And then I have these moments where I fall into this kind of despair for a couple of days, and I'm just like, did I go the wrong way with this work? Is it ever going to be finished? And then there's this great, burst of sunlight and joy at the end of the tunnel as it, finally becomes realized. And I would say that when the painting is finished, in terms of my feelings, I most often feel that what has manifested itself in the painting is, if everything's gone right and the way it should, it feels like something that is other than myself, that is other than what I surprise myself with what it is. I look at it and if I can say like, oh, that's odd, I didn't expect it to be like that, then that's a good thing. I feel like something else, it feels strange to me. And I think that's a sensation to have at the end of a painting.
That's the reward of being, I think, an artist, the feeling, I think, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, of course. So I would like to come on to the color gradations, materials, pigments, and achieving that visual presentation that you're talking about, and the overall chromatic parameters of it. How do you work on that? And what really is the process of you achieving that finished processed work?
Right. So like the technical aspect of it, like the materials that go into it, how the colors are chosen, things like that. Um, I actually it might surprise some people, but my painting techniques and materials are about as simple and basic and traditional as can be. I use oil paint with brushes. I don't use any mechanical devices. I do not use photographic references. I don't do anything on the computer, like any kind of mock-up or anything like that. I begin, very simply making a very simple kind of drafted image with a compass, to make these rounded edges and egg-like and spherical-like forms. And then the paint that I actually use is just oil paint. The only medium I really incorporate with my work is linseed oil. I use almost no other medium. It's very, very stripped down and simple. And what I usually like to do is have a very finished idea of what the painting's composition is going to look like before I start. And then the color choices are things that move the painting forward. When I make one color choice, usually I'll do the gradients of the background first. One feature of my work is these kind of gradients of color in the background, or these atmospheric dark spaces where there's like light from below and then this dark shadowy space above. And I usually will do that first, and that will give me a sense of what the feel tone is going to be. And then I sort of let those colors guide me and speak to me. I allow them to possess me and move me along. And a lot of times I like to contrast things. I like to think of what is a unexpected color I think my favorite color relationships are ones that are really unexpected and strange and alien, slightly natural, but maybe not quite natural.
That's what sets it apart. But also tell me about the time when you were beginning to explore and you coming to this current point when you are using oil and you are using this particular kind of vision. You have reached this vision after more than 15 to 16 years of your hard work and everything. Can you also tell me about how it was like before? What kind of mediums, what kind of materials you used, and what all experiments you have gone through, and now you're particularly using it? Is there something weird or anything that you have done before?
Oh yeah, yes, thank you. I mean, thanks for that question. Actually, that's something I don't get asked as much very often. It's interesting. I have tried so many different facets of art making and materials and things like that. For a period of time, I was making almost purely automatic paintings and using every kind of material I could find. I would do it with ink on paper and use synthetic materials or things that I found in the street. I would fasten them onto the canvas sometimes. I even went through a period not too long ago, actually, where I became interested in the symbolic qualities of materials themselves, how they almost transferred some kind of meaning or spirit into the painting through a kind of sympathetic magic. And there's a few paintings that I made years ago, they're probably out there somewhere, where I would actually take actual crystals. Like I would go to a crystal store and I would buy a piece of calcite or quartz, and then I would find a place to sort of fit it into the organic, biomorphic composition of the painting. And they would just kind of sit on there like a collaged element in relief. And, my thinking at the time was that even though my purpose for doing that might have been esoteric, it might have been something that others didn't understand necessarily, but my purpose in doing that was that it would almost through osmosis convey some kind of spirit or essence or meaning. But you know, at the end of the day, and there's so many other different explorations of style and approach, and you know, and actually going even further back to my early 20s, I was working in things back then that actually, as I think about them, anticipate the kind of paintings that I do now. They were made in oil. They had these sort of organic but mechanical or artificial looking forms. So there was always something there that anticipated what I'm doing now, but I certainly experimented in a wide range of materials and approaches to art making, sometimes even with more overtly human figurative elements, like bodily elements in them. But I think what happened about, you know, 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago is I reached this point where I was just doing so many different things and exploring so many different ways of making art that I just had a moment where I realized I needed to strip everything down. And though the kinds of painting I'm doing now might sometimes seem excessive or far-reaching in their you know, strange psychedelic meanings and interpretations, I actually see them as very reductive. I sort of purged everything that wasn't working. I purged everything that I didn't need, so that in the final version of my work, it would be just the most essential form, which for me was just oil paint on wood or canvas or linen, and forms that were suggestive of many things, human forms, entities, energies, things like that, but were reduced to their most primal geometric essence. So yeah, so that was like my process in coming to what I'm doing now after experimenting so widely over the years.
Oh my God, that's
It's
long
interesting.
way. It's very
I know.
interesting.
I
Like,
know.
oh
I
my
told you I was
God.
going to ramble a lot during this
Oh,
interview.
no,
I said,
this
I'm
is
going to be
amazing.
rambling
No,
a
but
lot.
I'm because random questions popping up, and I really want to keep it like, okay, but yeah, this is fantastic.
Yes.
But like the current work that I'm referring to, it very much transcends the overall time and space parameters, and it has a very different approach towards the work. So if I have to say consider in future, like say 50 or 100 years ahead, what impact do you think this one recent works that you have begun to do be impacting the people at that point? How do you see would be the future of this, and how people would perceive this?
How people would maybe perceive my work in the future, how it will be
Yeah,
seen in the future.
absolutely.
Uh, that's a hard I mean, I hope my work even exists, you know, 100
It
years from
transcends the
now.
time and space, so I'm sure it'll exist. So
I mean, you know, I was saying this to you a little bit. You know, before we started the interview, I think that the essence of art is something beyond time. So, you know, that sounds very out there and mystical. But what I mean by that is when we exist as human beings, you know, we're attached to our bodies, and our bodies are prone to decay and death. And because that is how we experience things through this slowly decaying vessel, it's hard for us to imagine an existence without time, being outside of time. But I think that the things that are created when we really enter into a creative state and we're making art or music or whatever it might be, I think these things have a eternal essence that is outside of time, outside of ourselves, outside of the physical realm of the world. So in some ways, I don't necessarily think of my work in the future or in the past, but the things that I'm creating, this essence that I'm creating when I paint, is somehow outside of that whole linear progress of time between past and future.
wow.
That said, it's interesting, to always kind of like imagine how, and I, as I mentioned, I'm an art history teacher. So it's interesting for me as an art history teacher to imagine how history is going to see the art not only created by me, but by peers of mine, other artists I know who are making art right now, how we're going to be interpreted. And certainly we're going to be seen in the context of our own time, whatever it is that's going on, whether it's COVID or the internet or, whatever geopolitical situation is happening. But I think that I am always hesitant to make a call on that. There's something and because I think the idea of how the future is going to contextualize your work is very uncertain. And one way I think about that is something I like to tell my students about is that, there's this academic painter, William Adolphe Bouguereau, who in the mid-19th century was the most celebrated artist of his day, this French academic painter. He won all the awards from the Salon, glowing reviews and so forth. You ask most art students, especially if they're just in their sophomore or junior year, some art students, art history students, some art history students might know who William Adolphe Bouguereau is, but most art students don't know who Bouguereau is. They'll just be like, who's that? What are those paintings? They're just exactly what you would think French academic painting was from the mid-19th century. But by contrast, you ask someone, who Vincent van Gogh is, and everyone knows who Vincent van Gogh is. We all have it's so ubiquitous within art history and within art schools. Both of them lived roughly around the same time in the same century. Bouguereau was widely celebrated as the Raphael of his day, and Vincent van Gogh was, virtually unknown, was completely unknown, eking out an existence in poverty. And we flash forward 100 years, and those positions are completely reversed, where Bouguereau is totally forgotten and Vincent van Gogh is ubiquitous in the culture. So that's my long-winded way of saying, that's why I don't even bother trying to think what 100 years in the future is going to see when they look back at my paintings or the paintings of our own age, because it may be something we can't imagine,
Yeah, it depends on the future.
Yeah, if we're in outer space, maybe old science fiction pulp novels or something are going to be more relevant than ever. Who knows?
Yeah, of course, fair enough. So this is oh my God, I just feel so nourished right now. This is amazing. I know that you explore the mediumistic art, and I know what really happens also a bit into the, say, the outcome of it, but I really don't understand what exactly it is. Can you please explain me a bit about that, and how it is, say, related to your work and the way that you approach your work, maybe?
So you're asking, what is mediumistic art?
Yeah.
And what is my interest in it, my relationship to it? And,
Yes.
I a couple of years ago, I did a lecture on mediumistic art for the Brooklyn Book Fair. It was online, and it's on YouTube. Actually, you can find it. It's my lecture on mediumistic art.
Okay.
And I talked about that area. Mediumistic art, because my work as a graduate student, an art history graduate student, led me to researching the relationship between occultism and 19th century art movements like spirit photography and symbolism, and these kinds of different art movements were part of my thesis. It naturally led me on the path of investigating and researching this genre that is referred to as mediumistic art. Now, mediumistic art is not a style. It's a subcategory of what is sometimes called outsider art. And outsider art is not a term that I necessarily like to use when referring to that kind of art. I prefer self-taught art. Outsider art, though, is a broadly understood. There's an outsider art fair. There's galleries that deal in outsider art. Art brut is another term that is sometimes used as part of this. So I like to, use self-taught art, but outsider art, though, is in general is a branch of art where the artist has not studied in academia. Sometimes they are completely outside of institutional civilization. There's someone who's completely self-taught. They make art out of a personal need or a personal passion. Something has compelled them or possessed them to make art. A lot of times, outsider art comes from people who are mentally ill and are in our therapy programs in hospitals where they're being cared for. The Prinzhorn collection in the early 20th century is a good example of this, where the German doctor collected all of these works by artists who were suffering from different kinds of mental illness.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
What kind of the mental illnesses they are?
All different kinds. I don't really, it depends what kind of artists we're talking about. But, for instance, there's an artist named Adolf Wolfi, German artist Adolf Wolfi with a W. And his work is very obsessive. It's all over. And I believe he was hospitalized for schizophrenia. And his work was a kind of personal therapy, but also a manifestation of these different states of mind that he found himself in due to his diagnosis. But it runs the whole gamut. Another famous example of an outsider artist would be Henry Darger. And Henry Darger, I don't necessarily think he had a particular diagnosis, but he was a very isolated individual who created this art, never went to art school, never was prodded to make art. And he created this art quietly in private, and it was only discovered after his death. So that is the kind of material that I'm talking about when I talk about outsider art, right?
Wow.
Now, mediumistic art is a subcategory of outsider art, right? So in mediumistic art, this is art that is created by people, often completely untrained, but that's not actually completely the case. Mediumistic art sometimes overlaps with artists who do have academic training in art. And I'll give you examples of this in a moment, but the defining feature of mediumistic art, though, is that the artist believes and the artist claims that the work they create is something that has been produced through them by another intelligence or another force or some kind of consciousness. Now, this could be, for instance, in the case of probably one of the most famous mediumistic artists, Hilma af Klint, who was the subject of the documentary. And she was the subject of the major retrospective at the Guggenheim. In her case, she was a highly trained academic painter. Hilma af Klint's early work is really beautiful work that would be categorized as being in the post-impressionist style of painting. And then she gets involved in a group that's performing seances and other occult experiments. And she gets in touch with these high masters, I believe she referred to them as, who were these elevated intelligences that she believed were beaming images and orders into her mind and compelling her to create certain works of art. And so her abstract paintings, which predate modern abstract art by at least a decade or so, in the 20th century, she claimed to have been the product of these spirits speaking through her. And in addition, you know, you have someone else like Paulina Peavy, who's an artist who's just now starting to emerge, an artist from the mid 20th century. My cat Midge is here helping me out. Say hello, Midge.
Hi, Midge. Yes.
Anyway, Paulina Peavy is an interesting example of mediumistic art, because in her case, she claimed that she had this encounter with a spiritual being that represented itself as a UFO. And
Wow.
I think it was La Como was the name that she called it,
Okay.
or La Como, something like that. And this being she believed to be connected with the UFO extraterrestrial phenomenon. This is like in the 50s and 60s, if my memory serves me. So that was part of the moment at the time, UFO phenomenon. And it began to work. And she actually believed this being, La Como, would take possession of her. And she would just automatically start making drawings and paintings. And one of the ways that she would kind of command it to take possession of her is she would put a mask on. And by putting the mask on, it would kind of transform herself, right? And I think there's something about that in a lot of artists' work, actually. And I think this is why Paulina Peavy is so fascinating. I still think about her every now and then, because, you know, we do in some ways transform ourselves. We become someone different when we're in that process of working. And, you know, like I put on just a kind of hazmat suit like thing so I don't get paint all over myself. Maybe that transformation, you know, puts me into this kind of, you know, zone when I'm making work. But
The altar.
Also, what?
The altar, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it alters the self, you know, and I think we do alter ourselves a little bit. We become someone else or something else. So anyway, I got off on this tangent talking about these two artists, but, you know, mediumistic art, you know, it can come in a lot of different forms. It can also be artists who have no formal training, like the artist Madge Gill, the British artist Madge Gill is a good example of this, who had a spirit that she called my inner rest, which sounds like my inner rest, like my inner peace.
My inner peace.
You know, and my inner rest would create works through her. And sometimes she would be worried that my inner rest, she would like anger my inner rest and it wouldn't give her drawings and stuff. But Madge Gill's interesting because she had no training as an artist, and yet she creates these obsessive tiny worlds with small faces and hallucinatory
This is
detail.
intense. Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, it's a and you can see why I did a whole lecture on this and why I became fascinated with it.
I have to watch that. I have to watch that.
Yeah, sure. Watch it.
I'm gonna watch it.
You know, I think this is also something that is emerging in the moment. I see it more and more
coming up on the surface.
Talking about this idea of mediumistic art. Now, for me as an artist, to address the second part of your question, the reason I became interested in this, first of all, as an art historian, it had a natural interest for me. But then as an artist, I think it was because, as we talked about at the beginning of this, I had so many strange experiences, psychedelic experiences, visionary experiences, things that could be called paranormal, I suppose. It opened my mind in a way to the realities that these artists claim to experience. And when I would read about their, you know, working process and what they were doing, it resonated with me. I don't consider myself, as I like to be very clear saying this, I don't consider myself a mediumistic artist, because my work is made very consciously. There might be, and this is something I also like to distinguish when I talk about this topic. There's a difference between artists going into a kind of flow state or meditative state, as I do, as many artists do when they're working, and you get into this, you know, or an ecstatic state, you know, kind of elevated
trance. Yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
We talked about this too. You had like experiences while drawing, and, you know, and you get into these states where you feel like something is flowing through you, but I know that I am the author of my work. Now, it may come from some other kind of aspect of myself, perhaps, but I don't say there's a spirit that I, like manifest through me, right? So, right. But but I understand, though, the experiences that these artists talk about, and that to me is sometimes more interesting in some ways than a lot of the other aspects of art making, and or just not more interesting. Nothing. I don't want to say one
But
thing
that
is more
intelligence
interesting than the other.
helps you, and that intelligence supports you. That overall knowledge itself is very much kind of like a very important tool for you to find us, I think, in many ways. It's fantastic what you just
Yes,
about it.
it makes the world of art richer to explore these other
That
very alternative ideas about where art comes from and how art is made, I think. So hopefully that explains that question a little
very well, very, very well. So I know that you explored the alternate realms of reality, building a sort of psychological and say spiritual ascension. So what advice or suggestion you'd like to give to the people who are struggling at this point, or maybe wanting to seek answers in the world? And if do you, okay, so if you wish people to be more also conscious or be aware about something and be sincere about something in this current day and age, so explaining maybe your alternate realms of reality experiences and your overall, say, purpose of, I'm not sure if a purpose, but sort of like, implementing that sort of spiritual and psychological ascension through your work. Many people can understand it, but not. But in words, if you have to kind of say help and suggest to the people who are seeking the answers, which they cannot read through your work, what you would say to them?
Right. So almost what value does this have for others, for the world? What
More than that, there is a for sure a value, but then what advice you'd give to the people who are seeking answers in the world right now, and you are working with this sort of spiritual ascension and psychological ascension? So say the people who are struggling with the mental health, for example, or say navigating, they're finding it hard to navigate in the world right now with everything that's happening, the politics, for example, or the environment for that matter, so yeah, with your experiences of this sort of like alternate realms that you have touched, how you would like to help people, and what advice you'd give to them?
Yeah, I understand. I hesitate to, pretend that my advice is really important or special for anyone, but I do think that if we really embrace the possibility of these spiritual realms, if we embrace the possibility of a world of the mind or a world of the soul outside of time, outside of yourself, your individual self, it it does create in you a greater awareness, a higher awareness of the interconnectedness that we all share, both with each other and with our environment. And I think that is the thing for me that is, the most poisonous about this very non-metaphysical, nihilistic, very materialistic, solidified nature that we find in the 21st century. So, I guess I would say to other people to think, outside of yourself, to think about how you are connected to the rest of the world, and to see everyday things as being more than just their physical, solid nature. Things like, water or stone have more than just their physical, empirical qualities, that there's something about them that is invisible to the eye, but is also connected to the rest of the world. And I had said this to you a little bit before. this is my own perspective. I don't necessarily know if I can prescribe it to everyone, but I am a bit more of an animist. If I had to designate myself in any way, I would say I'm an animist, or where I feel a strong kinship with the view of panpsychism. You know, panpsychism, like all things have consciousness.
Consciousness, yeah.
And I think that, and even not embracing that like it's a faith or a religion, but just entertaining that as being a possible truth behind the nature of our world, it opens us up to a bit of a greater sense of our own personal responsibility and our own personal fragility within, you know, this giant cosmic web that we find ourselves in. Now, in terms of what people can do with that knowledge, you know, as artists or as young people who are struggling or distraught, you know, I mean, there's a lot to be said. I do think though that sometimes a lot of despair and a lot of suffering comes from nihilism and comes from materialism and the belief that what is in front of us is all there is. So, you know, I think that it could be a way out of that cycle of suffering, but, you know, everyone's got to, you know, go through their own path. I haven't found the cure to suffering myself. If someone does find the cure, let me know, you know, because it still happens, you know. But I think a large part of it is a feeling like that's all there is, that there's just this material existence and we can, you know, learn nothing else beyond what's right in front of us. And I think that also, to go on a rant here, I think that also is part of what creates this sort of poison attitude in the 21st century for me, that I describe as a kind of Machiavellianism, like this, like, I'm out for myself,
On
you know,
point,
no
yes.
one else matters. It's just me acquiring power and possessions and money and things like that. And, you know, I mean, we all need money and we need to survive, right? You know, and people need to eat and things like that. But I think that there's this pervasive nihilistic Machiavellianism that has just grown since the beginning of our century. And maybe one of the cures for that is, you know, the de-emphasizing of the material and the re-emphasizing of the spiritual, and or at least not the spiritual, if maybe the invisible that connects us all. You got me off on another rant.
I have the answer for the suffering if you want. I tell you, music.
That is good.
Music is the answer.
That is a good cure. Making art is a good cure.
So yeah, I'd like to know what genre of music you often listen to and how that influences the work and your psyche, and how that has, of course, also helped you in many ways.
Oh boy. Well, I listen to some pretty unusual music. I tend to be attracted towards music that's somewhat dark or sad or
Everyone has gone through that
melancholy in
phase.
some
Yeah. Okay.
you know, but you know, growing up when I was a teenager, like the first kind of really interesting music that I became passionate about was like very underground industrial noise kind of music, like like bands like Throbbing Gristle and Current 93 and Coil. You know, I think like the gateway drug was probably Nine Inch Nails, and then it's like straight to, you know, Throbbing Gristle or something like that. And I still love that kind of music. But I'll also listen to like electronic music, like Hero Kone on Deus Records. I've been listening to their album lately, and you know, there's a lot of interesting electronic music that I just kind of like to have in the background so it can create an atmosphere. But I'd say that for my own take, I tend to prefer things that are a little experimental, a little bit more atmospheric. I was at one time in a few bands actually, and also I've done my
Okay.
own kind of like projects, and they were very, harsh noise kind of,
Mhm.
projects, that I was doing. And I still like to play around with doing experimental sounds when I have the ability to, but for me, music has become more of something where I can use it to induce a kind of a mood or a experience while I'm working, or it is just like this thing that I'm, I just geek out on and become a fan about, and I love investigating these obscure niche genre musical performers and stuff, so that's how that plays a role in my work.
Uh, um, these days, people are going so much after psychedelic plant medicine healing things, and the recreational treats that are happening. And specifically right now in COVID, you see people are indulging themselves into more and more of such recreational retreats. What do you think about that, and the healing and the say evoking powers that it holds? Because it's there in every culture, and it's talked about it, it's talked about in great lengths, and it's just there, but legally it's something that's still fighting its space. So what do you think about that? I mean, what are your thoughts about the emerging communities all across the globe talking about it and working with it?
That is an interesting sign of the times, isn't it? You had sent me that link to a microdosing project for, I believe it was for executives. Is that who that's targeted at? Like,
Yeah, making it more of like it's kind of reframing the thoughts for psychedelics that people have, just like providing a much more deeper understanding of what psychedelics is. I think that's what I think I should really.
yeah, it's so fascinating to me though, because part of how psychedelics have entered into the conversation in the last few years has been through this talk about microdosing, and somehow microdosing making you more efficient. Both, it's become this trend in Silicon Valley and
Mhm.
in kind of corporate circles, and it seems so antithetical to me to the actual experience of psychedelics. I mean, I've taken small, what could be considered microdoses of psilocybin mushrooms, and I don't, they kind of make you feel a little stoned and a little, weird, and, makes things a little strange, and you kind of want to go outside and walk in the woods and stuff. But I don't see how it would make you a productive, business person necessarily. It seems like that kind of aggressive capitalist mentality that is required for business, like Wolf of Wall Street types. I'm like imagining like, who is that, like Leonardo DiCaprio in the Wolf of Wall Street or whatever, taking psilocybin. It would totally, chill him out. He'd be the total opposite of what he is in that movie. It doesn't seem like a very corporate production kind of drug to me, which is what I find so mysterious about it. But maybe the appeal, as I was saying, is, with the growth of interest in mediumistic art, maybe part of the rising appeal that psychedelics have for our time is that certain systems, economic systems, ecosystems, political systems, are seeming to spin so out of control that we're looking for any kind of left of field alternative
Kind of.
answer or experience outside of
Wow.
the world, right?
I
Like,
didn't think it this way at all,
could
actually.
that
This
be
is
it? Could
such
that
a
be it?
fresh. Mhm. Very much.
Because I don't know if, like, for me the drug of like capitalism and production is like caffeine. Like you get juiced up on caffeine and then you can do your work and stuff. And it seems like, why would you be looking into psychedelics? And the only thing that I can imagine is that psychedelics shut down certain sensory devices within the brain, but
Mhm.
emphasize others.
Yeah.
It transforms the veil of the world that you're experiencing life through. So
Fair
maybe
enough.
there's some hope that, maybe within this, there's some kind of hope that this lost way can find itself through
Mhm.
the experience.
Yes.
But
I,
I
I
think it's
just,
fascinating, though. Definitely, I don't know about the rest of the world, but definitely in the United States, the legality of psychedelics is growing. I
mhm.
think Oregon State now is either they just passed something where it's now legal to use psilocybin mushrooms medically for therapy
Wow.
reasons. I think that's the case. Don't quote me on. I'm not a news person, but I hear things like this. And of course, marijuana has been mostly
Yes, yes, yes.
decriminalized and legalized in many states in the United
Mhm.
States. So, perhaps this is a very large shift in the world.
No, but this is, oh my God, this is, I think, also need of time. But anyway, the problem with the world, I know that there's a lot of problems in the world, and it has existed earlier, it exists now, and would exist in the future. So, what are the things that you'd like to say about the physical reality of our lives? I mean, what is the philosophy that you work with? What keeps you sane in this insanity? Simple.
Well, I completely unplug myself from the 21st century whenever it gets too much for me and
Mhm.
retreat into the time of no time, the time of no history. No, I don't know what I'm saying, but I do think that yeah, how do we keep our sanity during these times? I think a large part of the feelings of anxiety that we feel on a mass scale as a collective globally, I feel a lot of that is our own kind of neurofeedback loop where we create these fears and then we feed them back out into the world and then they're fed back to us. And that's not to say that there aren't real issues that need to be dealt with and that people need to take action and cause change in their world. I don't know what the best, again, I'm just a person who makes paintings. And an art historian. I don't know what the best strategy is for dealing with these. But I do think to not accept this kind of nihilistic, Machiavellian, um, you know, everyone for themselves
Mhm.
attitude is a starting point. It's something you can do, and in little ways, we'll gradually change the world around us. And I think also it does help to kind of change your setting. And this is kind of a magical idea, like if you can create a set, and this actually goes towards what we said with Paulina Peavy wearing the mask, right?
Mhm.
You create this alternate self, this kind of costume persona, and you yourself become transformed. I also feel if we just change a few local things, either in our homes, in our own personal lives, in our town or our neighborhood or whatever, that starts to change. It has a ripple effect of changing the greater global system. And I relate that to certain magical ideas, like in like magical rituals and stuff. People will create some, or even in psychedelic experiences, people will create something called set and setting, where you essentially just create an ambiance around yourself. It's like what you find in a temple or a church. You get mood lighting, you have certain
Yeah.
colors in front of you, you burn certain incense and candles, and then you can go into that space. That's what I do, by the way, when I attempt to meditate. I don't follow transcendental meditation guidelines or anything. I just
Mhm.
kind of get into a atmospheric space and have whatever I need there to go into this mindset. But I think that is a metaphor for something that can be applied on a small scale to the world. You know, now, like anything, easier said than done for anyone. But, you know, if I had to offer some possible path, I would say this kind of starting with micro transformations, small transformations, and these things can have greater ripple effects than you realize. If that answers your question there.
It's deep.
Okay, I'm probably, if you ask me later, what did you say? What did you mean by that?
No,
again?
I'm understanding. It's just like my mind is just taking, like it's taking time to understand and catch on that wavelength. It's amazing. That's the word that I have, because it's.
Thank you, Jack.
Wow. Okay, so I know that altered state of mind is something that you are equipped with. You have understood very much of it, the parapsychology of it. What are the kind of films that are striking to you at this moment?
Oh, right. Yeah. So, you know, I was saying too, like, I watch a lot of movies, specifically of the horror film genre. So I watch a lot of horror movies, and they do relate. And every now and then I do come across these films, especially recently. Again, this goes towards this kind of zeitgeist moment where people are microdosing, and there's a growing interest in mediumistic art. And I'm noticing more and more in popular culture, in Netflix shows and movies and stuff, I'm noticing more and more these themes that are in my work and in my own research that, you know, maybe it's because that's my filter, you know, that's my lens that I hold up to the world. I just see them. But like the other day, I watched this movie by a director, Ben Wheatley, who did a film called A Field in England. And he did another film called Kill List, which is very rough to watch. I don't recommend it to everyone. And he did a recent film called In the Earth, which is also kind of, it has some gory, shocking moments in it.
I did watch In the Earth, and you're reminding me of Suspiria at the same time. Like
Suspiria a little bit? Yeah, I can see that actually, with the color and the dark kind of. What did you think? Were you disturbed by it?
Oh my God.
In the Earth I thought it was a great movie. It's not, if you're looking
for dark though, it's super dark.
It's very dark. It's very, I mean, when the guy's like foot gets cut, you know, I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it's like,
oh my God, no, I went much ahead. I just dropped in the end. I was like, 20 minutes, I cannot watch it anymore. This guy's coming in the light and this entire thing is happening. They've put in this entire setup and it's just blowing my mind. I'm like, yeah. Did you watch it in the theater or did you watch it on TV? Theater, I would have. Oh my God. Like hands, I swear. It's very dark. Like, I think people who understand the mechanics and the science behind it, I think would literally shit in their pants. I swear. It's just too okay. But yeah, let's talk about something good. The spirituality, you know, a bit, the good part of it. So what future do you imagine for spirituality? For spirituality, yeah. You know, again, it's like with art, I hesitate to predict a future because things turn around so quickly. We never know what technological innovation is going to transform how we see things tomorrow, you know, how we see art tomorrow. And I think spirituality is very similar. I do think that just looking at the 20th century into the 21st century, I've noticed that technological language has become increasingly a part of how we talk about spiritual conditions, especially when we're talking about something that is somewhat more esoteric or occult, like, you know, Gnostic thought and things like that. And, you know, one of the features that has emerged in the last, you know, few decades is this idea that we're living in some kind of a simulation, right? Like the Matrix movie, right? Again, going back to movies here. But, you know, that language, though, the idea of a simulation, that the universe is coded in some way, like a program, like a game
video game program. That whole language is just something that we have because of the technology that's emerged. Just as in the 20th century, there was a lot of, conversations in New Age groups about spiritual beings and ascended masters being related to UFO phenomenon or the outer space world.
Yeah.
So if I had to say what I see for the future, the invisible world will not change. It will always remain what it is, which is something that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. I try my own way to try to communicate what I think of it, but who can really communicate this? That will never change. But I do think that as new technologies emerge, which they inevitably will have just a different frame of reference and a different kind of language for talking about it. So that's kind of what I see,
I can
when
for
next
some-
generation or two.
Yeah, for some reason, I don't know why your entire answer made me think of astrology for some reason. I don't know why, but it just made me think about it. But yeah.
Astrology is one of these things like psychedelics. I've been seeing more and more people have, it's grown in popularity. It's grown in acceptance.
Yeah.
It is something where, 10 years ago, maybe 90% of people would have been like, astrology, really? And nowadays, it's very common for people to get astrology readings or to consult them online. I don't know what that is. Maybe, it's a system. Astrology is a system. It is something you can kind of learn and diagram. And
it's considered like a pseudoscience. It's like sacred science or something of that sort. So, yeah.
Well, today's pseudoscience might be tomorrow's
normal
science.
Yeah, I think so. And what is spirituality for you? This is my last question.
Okay. What is spirituality for me? I am kind of, I'm one of those people who, says, well, I don't really belong to any one school of religion or one school of thought. I'm very part of the postmodern world in that way. I think we each create our own spirituality and our own traditions. For me, though, spirituality is tied with that kind of intuitive sense that you feel in your heart of the invisible around you. And that's different for every person. And, it can be, anyone can experience that, whether that's, wherever they come from or whatever their religious framework might be. So that's what I think spirituality is.
Oh my God, it has been such a pleasure. I cannot tell you how much fun I had to. Yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Alessandro.
And thank you so much, Jag. It's great to talk to someone. A lot of what we talked about, it's very like personal for me. It's like a very personal thing, and I get like emotional when I talk about it. Yeah. And it's nice to like feel like I feel like we can talk about this, and I'm like, I'm not thinking, oh, she think I'm crazy or something.
No.
So that's very nice. That's a very nice.
We can speak for hours. I think like this is something which is endless, but I think we have a limitation and we have a deadline. So yeah.
We've been going a long time now.
Yes, for sure. But like, I think, we'll get on calls another time. And yeah, this is fantastic. I had so much fun doing this. And thank you so much. And I hope that you someday soon come to Italy. And and I get to meet you in person.
All right. Thank you so much.